Mum says it's my turn to make the MMOs Dying video this month.
Hello, I'm Josh Dreyfus. I make videos about MMORPGs. Unfortunately, because the player base of MMOs tends to be slightly older and slightly more jaded, one of the most popular types of videos in this genre is the MMOs Dying video. We seem to get one every few months. It's usually a similar flavour of doom and gloom and pining for the past and missing the days gone by. Now, everything has been discussed, from nostalgia to the economic climate the early games released into, the early novelty of online chat rooms, the rise of pay-to-win mechanics, too many MMOs cannibalising the rather finite player base, kids preferring faster-paced matchmaking games, group finders replacing overworld community focus with digital waiting rooms. Most angles of MMO change have already been covered by many creators.
Now, these creators are talented, passionate, and knowledgeable people. They're not wrong with their critiques of how the genre has changed, and the way we experience MMOs and the dominance they once had over the online landscape has definitely changed from birth to now. We're not in high school anymore. Those endless late nights of guild runs on TeamSpeak are a memory. Most of us have responsibilities, but I don't think it's nostalgia to blame, and I don't think the genre is dying. You need only look at the success of the World of Warcraft OnlyFans guild drama and its stranglehold on livestream fails, or the constant push for Ashes of Creation, or the return of the player base every time Final Fantasy XIV has an expansion. People actively want these types of games to exist. They want to play them. But one angle I'd like to consider in relation to the modern MMO's decline and their launch is audience expectations of what kind of experience a new MMO will give them in relation to the experience they've had in an old one.
Audience expectations of what this genre is and what games launching into it need to provide from day one are becoming unrealistic. I think we're reaching a theoretical stagnation point, and we now go through cycles of player-based burnout, meaning expansion into other games, and then contraction back into the main successful few, with each cycle of burnout, expansion, and contraction killing off the smaller games that cannot survive, consolidating the player base, which means while new, smaller games within the genre are dying, the genre itself is fine, if concentrated. So let's discuss that. As usual, a massive thank you to all the supporters on Patreon and Twitch who keep this channel alive. More information on how you can support at the end. For now, let's begin. Now, unfortunately, many deeply enfranchised and sometimes unhinged MMO players assume critique of their favourite game is critique of them. This leads to them sending rather hate-filled messages, so unfortunately I need to preface this video now. Critique of a game you like isn't critique of you, and complaints against a game you have made part of your personality for some reason isn't a complaint against you. We will see later how creating deep-rooted emotional bonds to a game, essentially validating your physical self through your virtual identity, is absolutely a thing hardcore players do, and many MMOs encourage, but it is also remarkably unhealthy and sometimes even dangerous. Now, for player expectations, context is key here. We need to set a baseline with what normal non-MMO games do, how the player relates to them and enjoys them, and then how all genres change over time anyway, before adding in the absurd development time and costs now associated with MMOs, the curse of the forever game. How many MMOs rely on creating a connection to community over gameplay, and then linking it together to explain MMO stagnation.
This means we'll be layering understanding of one concept onto understanding of another to get a more complete grip of what's actually happening, but bear with me, I'll break it all down into bite-sized chunks and it will make sense. So let's start with the most basic early video game business model. Here's the classical gaming release, the idealized 5 steps. A company has an idea for a game, so raises some money and makes the best possible game they can. That's important. People then buy it and play it. They complete it, then they move on and play another game. That's an essential step. But the final step is if a player wants to return and play the game again, they can. Nothing will have changed, sometimes stuff gets added. Your life situation and the involvement of others will of course have changed from the first time you played it to now, but the game experience itself will not. That won't have changed too much at all. Now, I've simplified this to an absurd degree, but each step in this classical idealistic process actually has a rather strong benefit to the player.
The company raises money and makes the game, and once it's made, that's kind of it. The game releases, yes, you'll have marketing and maybe some support staff, but it's usually money invested, game made, investment recouped by selling the game and the game being good. So there's a rather vested interest in the game being good because the quality of the game will become the main income point. Better games tend to sell more. Microtransactions come later. For now, the sale of the game is the main income. People buy the game, usually a one-time purchase, then they own the game. They can play it on any console which can run it or install it on several computers. If it's on their shelf, it's theirs. Play at your own pace. The simplicity of this is beautiful. There's no fear of missing out, no time-limited offers, no pressure to finish within a month. It's your game. Play it when you like. And call me archaic, but I quite like this system. Then the player completes the game. The game has a story arc, a beginning, a mechanical or narrative interesting middle bit, and then a satisfying ending. Loose ends are tied up. The credits roll. The art is over. It doesn't need to drag on for the sake of dragging on. It is exactly as long as it needs to be to keep the quality as high as it can. Then, and this is important, players move on and play other games. The game wants a set amount of your time, it will give you a set experience, and once you've had that experience, off you go. Experience other games. Enjoy variety. The key point is the game doesn't benefit from keeping you around any longer because it can't gain any more money out of you. It's not harmed if you go and play other games. And if you do want to return to this game in the future, that's fine too, like reading a favourite old book or watching a favourite old film. Stability can be nice. Sometimes nostalgia even holds up. I have a whole second channel about reviewing older games through a modern lens. I've even discovered some games I've never played that I now really enjoy. That's the classical ideal of making a video game. But MMOs sort of changed this formula, refining it, and not for the better, because it shares a lot in similarity with a casino. You can't really map the steps of normal game design onto an MMO because they are both trying to gain different things from the players. It's no longer about being a good game as much as it is about being a good enough game which holds an online community. And then the connections the players form to the experience as a whole keeps them around. They become citizens and heroes of a virtual world, with all the emotional investment and parasocial attachment that brings. They're not just people playing a game they'll move on from. They are customers and denizens of your online virtual reality, and will stay that way for as long as you can keep them there. The initial sales of an MMO are no longer the primary income source for the game, and this has a knock-on effect on just about everything. First off, the money needed to make a new MMO is just astronomical. Players expect a new game to release with a similar amount of content to other already established games, which is simply unrealistic. If another game has been out for 10 years, it has had 10 years worth of growth. A new game will not. But players keep demanding it, and companies keep trying to develop it, and development costs go up and up and up, which means they have a vested interest in gaining more and more and more money from you. This leads to a situation where you don't just buy it and play it. You buy it, subscribe to it, and possibly buy the additional battle pass, or in-game premium currency, or cosmetics, or physical collector's edition with exclusive in-game stuff, and now each of these things could be a video unto itself. But the biggest effect of MMO design is in the next two steps. You don't complete it, because MMOs aren't designed to be completed. In fact, the complete opposite. And the few players who do manage to hit the completion of a game, such as achieving a completionist cape in RuneScape or every single achievement in WoW, are heralded as masters of the game. It is an event because it is not expected. But doing this comes at a cost to you personally, most notably how you will not have time to play other games to this level. There's a scene in the TV show NCIS, a show famous for trying to add the most ridiculous computer things ever, where a detective meets a video game player and recognizes her as the person who has the highest score in almost every online game ever. This firmly cements the show in the no idea how games work territory, but it also reinforces how that's just not possible, and completing an MMO is a lifelong goal. Guild Wars 1 has gods walking amongst mere mortals, an incredibly demanding title, and you're unlikely to meet someone who has that title, and a RuneScape completionist cape, and every WoW achievement, and every Guild Wars 2 achievement, and every Elder Scrolls Online achievement, because those achievements have surpassed what we would consider traditional video game achievements and are encroaching onto the professional of a hobby area. But it's highly likely you could meet someone who has completed and platinumed every Tomb Raider game, because the design and the time demands of the games are different. Those games don't benefit from keeping you around once you have seen everything they have to offer. MMOs do. So from a company's point of view, the ideal MMO player picks a game and sticks with it because an addicted player, an enfranchised player, has the potential to become a whale, a high-spending individual. We've looked before at how whale hunting is a gaming science, with so many MMOs incentivized to add more content, more challenges, more stuff, just to keep those whales on their game. Which tracks, because the kind of person who is going to get deeply involved into an MMORPG is often the kind of player who enjoys having a lot of content to experience. And if content is then king, older games have the crown. Because older MMO games have an absolute ton of content by virtue of simply being around longer and having more time to add stuff. The original EverQuest, as of this video, has 31 full expansions. If a new MMO released an expansion every 6 months, it wouldn't catch up in 15 years. Now, this amount of content takes years to make and should not be expected straight out of the gate, but it has been normalized as expected. And this is where audience expectations comes in. Because what an MMO player often wants, years of content and fleshed out endgame, is not provided by newer games as much as older games, simply because they haven't got to that point yet. Consider what different players want. Some want graphics, some want combat, some want PvP, some want epic storylines, fantasy, sci-fi, some want deep mechanics. But what a player wants will change genre to genre, game to game. Is there any through line that almost every player shares? Well, let's take another genre to have a look at an example. Real-time strategy, one of my favorites. Build up an army, go and attack somebody else. Now, in my experience, people who enjoy these games place greater emphasis on gameplay and mechanics over graphics or narrative. You may feel different, I'm just going off what I've experienced over the years. Because the real-time strategy player tends to have a focus on mechanical complexity and balance, older games which have had longer to add stuff and refine their gameplay simply provide what the player base of this genre wants better. Age of Empires 4 is fine, but many prefer Age of Empires 2 simply because of how many player mods it has, how many armies, the units. It provides the experience the player base want from this genre. Even though it's older, Command & Conquer Red Alert 2 hit that balance of action and tactics in a way which Command & Conquer 4 missed, showing that newer doesn't always mean better. Newer means different, and sometimes that difference is not an improvement. Companies may realize, hey, we've not had a real-time strategy game in a while. Then, instead of looking at what real-time strategy players actually want in a game, they look at what modern gaming is as a whole, then try and force that kind of audience into a vaguely real-time strategy-shaped game. Then they wonder why their newer game doesn't appeal to an established older player base. If what your core audience want is already being delivered to them, what is going to make them come to your game and stay if it doesn't deliver that? Now, nostalgia is absolutely a factor in this, of course, but going in depth on that psychological draw is a whole different video. So let's just agree nostalgia is a factor in deciding what game to play, but audience expectation is the focus here.
To circle back to MMOs, we then need to ask, what does an MMO player want? And this varies. Some want combat, some want narrative, some want PvP, some want fantasy Eastern style graphics, some want grounded Western style, some want pay to win, others don't. The wants of each MMO player are of course different. But there's one thing, one narrative thread, a through line that almost every MMO player does want, one thing we agree on. We all want a massive game. It's right there in the first M of the acronym. We want loads of stuff. Years of content, a second world to live in. The dedicated MMO player doesn't want to blitz through a game in 10 hours, 100 hours, maybe even 1,000 hours. They want a single game they can treat as an alternate reality, a hobby. And it's this combination of player investment, burnout, and expectations for what the game can give, which leads to this inevitable cycle.
A player finds an MMORPG game they like. They invest in it, play it for weeks, months, or years, sink a load of their free time into it, and the nature of MMO design encourages this. It facilitates it. It releases more content, more grinds, more long-term goals. And this is great. The mechanics of the game may not be the greatest, but the mechanics are secondary to the experience as a whole. Because the player has formed friendships, bonds, guilds, they've become known within the community. The game becomes more than a game to them. It becomes a home. But eventually, the design of endless grind will cause a player to burn out and fancy a change, if only for a little bit. As lovely as home is, we all like a holiday. And so they swap games. But on average, studies have shown they only swap games for a bit before coming home. Much like a holiday, it's not permanent. They will try a new game, and suddenly they're not part of the established community already. They are a new player. They have no emotional investment in this new game they try, which means the mechanics of that game, instead of being secondary as they were in their home, are now the focus on their holiday. And they question, is this fun to play without friends? Is it a good game without all of the supporting lifestyle and connections that we've made? Does it stand up without nostalgia? Much like how making friends as an adult is far harder than making friends as a kid, interaction with other players in this new game to you becomes sparse, it becomes difficult. You don't want to put the emotional time, energy and investment into building an entire new friendship group up again, and now the game needs to shine on its own mechanical merits, which sets up a bit of a paradox. We judge our favourite MMORPG heavily off the emotional experiences we had within it, and we judge newer games off the mechanical experiences we have within them. Now, some people may indeed find a new game they actually prefer by doing this, but the call to your home is only ever one expansion away, one new raid, one new class revealed, and then your holiday ends, your emotional connection kicks back in, and you want to return to familiar ground with familiar faces and familiar mechanics, back to what you know. As nice as novelty is, familiarity is a soft, comforting blanket. Other genres experience this too. However many racing games release, I will still prefer Burnout 3 on the PS2 or SSX Tricky. However many first-person shooters we get, I'll always enjoy Unreal Tournament or the original Modern Warfare 2 because they provide the experience that I want. But unlike those games, which can still exist with no player base and multiplayer matches can be made as and when you need them, MMOs do need a player base to survive because they have ongoing hosting costs, or any new player that arrives will just instantly leave when they realize there's no one around. This is where the effective culling of the player base caused by the expansion and contraction phenomenon we'll look at in a second effectively happens. Let's visualize this. Imagine 3 games, we'll just call them A, B, and C, each with a player base of 100 people. This is unrealistic, but it keeps the numbers nice and simple. People will play their game until they get burned out. This will differ from person to person. Some people will commit their entire life to it, some people will leave within a week. But let's imagine the next time we check these numbers, we discover that 20 players from game A have gone to game B, 10 from game B have gone to game C, and 5 from game C have gone to game A. Does this mean game A is dying? Does it mean B is growing? Does it mean C is somewhat stable? It could mean both all of and none of these things. It could be the natural flux of a finite amount of players within a genre simply moving around. But what happens when an expansion for game B releases and suddenly 20 players from A and 20 players from C decide to hop back over? Is B now the best game? Do players from A and C suddenly look at the numbers and think, oh no, my game is dying, best hop ship to a successful one, and B now gains more players? Maybe A and C both respond by releasing expansions at the same time and B loses a ton of players to both of them. But now imagine a new company has seen this finite player base and wants a piece of the pie, so they create game D. Now because D is new, it doesn't have as much content as A, B, or C, but it has a new art style and a new combat loop, so a few people from each game go to try it because they're burnt out of their current game. It might even bring some entirely new people into the genre who weren't there before, which is great. But then over time those players also go through the same burnout cycle and expand away from D to try one of the other 3 games, A, B, or C. Maybe D releases an expansion to encourage people to return, but it's now competing with 3 already established games and it just can't keep up with the amount of content. And it's starting to lose money too, because it was expensive to make and expensive to run, so it adds some pay-to-win stuff into the cash shop to milk the whales it does have. We can start to see that D is likely to fall into a spiral of pay-to-win, which, while undoubtedly generating money in the short term, is going to have long-term ramifications for its stability.
Now imagine this kind of battle playing out every month. But remember, each of these games is also expensive to run. They have upkeep costs, and every time they lose a player to another game, they lose money, and operating at a loss eventually leads to a game shutting down. How long each individual game can operate at a lower player count for depends on the company funding it, how deep its pockets are, but each game will have its own limit. This cycle plays out more and more every year. Players move from game to game, burning out, trying a new thing, then returning home, and every year more and more games try to enter the MMO arena, bringing new players with them into the genre, taking existing players temporarily from existing games, then those players burn out and return home or try other games. The only question is, will that new game survive and become a mainstay of the genre, or ultimately just another part of this inevitable churning cycle that brings players in, then consolidates them all into a larger game?
This closed ecosystem of players who want MMO experiences continues to bounce from game to game because for the average player, each game cannot be completed, only played until your own personal burnout limit is reached. This means you'll see established game populations rise and fall like the ebbs and flows of the tide. And then when a new game appears, it will boom in popularity from novelty and holidaying players, then stabilize at whatever population decides to make that game their home, which is usually far lower than the maximum player cap it saw, as many of those players return to their original game. We saw this happen when New World released. If we take regular single-player games and visualize the same system, it would be game releases, gets completed, all the player base move on to the next game, complete it, player base move on, complete, move on, with each game designed to be as fun as it can be so players want to move on to the next one. The MMO genre, by design, wants to keep players on a game as long as possible, which means games need to both evolve but also not change. Because major changes are risky, you are moving the player base on. Sometimes this works, like Guild Wars and Guild Wars 2, with the latter being hugely successful. Sometimes it doesn't, like old-school RuneScape and RuneScape the Evolution of Combat, with the older version being more dominant. So with all this theory discussed, why do people say the genre is dying? Well, remember we discussed that whatever a player may want, we all want a massive game. Every expansion and contraction cycle a game survives gives it the chance to become bigger to add more stuff. It's like those snake IO games, larger snakes consuming smaller snakes and more content. It's a major pull for the player base. So newer games are expected to release with as much content as the big boys have, but without the years of success and income and adapting they've gone through. If they don't have this and can't provide the experience that an MMO player wants, how many expansion and contraction cycles can that new game survive? Especially when players will start with that game, discover other games, and then move over to them. This leads to a situation where MMO players on average value the sheer amount of content in a game above other things. Players may have graphical preferences or narrative design preferences, but collectively we all want our massively multiplayer game to be massive. This gives player retention advantages to games which simply have more content, and this is seen in older, more established games. So the genre is not dying because there are still players, but the player expectation of what an MMO is and the extreme amount of content an MMO is expected to have are so warped by what long-term major games have given them that new games struggle to compete. They don't survive the expansion and contraction process, they lose players to larger games which provide a better experience and fall into a death spiral because they're not making money. The gameplay experience and amount of content an MMORPG player wants is just better served by a game that's already been providing that for years. Consider that if World of Warcraft had never existed and yet the genre had still succeeded, if World of Warcraft released as it released back then, today, it itself may not survive, because it would not have as much content as Final Fantasy XIV, Guild Wars 2, or The Elder Scrolls Online. So the MMO genre isn't dying. However, new games which release into the genre often do die because the players who enjoy the genre may go to try the new game but ultimately realize they aren't having their needs or expectations met by that new game. We've almost built ourselves into a catch-22. Newer MMOs struggle due to lack of content, but they'd only gain that content if they survived, which they need the content to do. It's a cycle, and companies are realizing that trying to break into it is just far too expensive.
This means the players those newer games brought in, if they like the genre as a whole, will then migrate to another game, and the migration will continue until they settle in a home. And then, when they are burned out of the home, they'll expand and contract again, with the death cycle of games happening slowly, consolidating all the players down into just a few behemoths of the genre. The few largest games, the ones capable of surviving a downturn in players because they have the most money. As for the undeniable reduced market dominance of MMOs when compared to online games like Fortnite, League of Legends or Roblox, MMOs may be older, slower, a gameplay experience that plays out over weeks instead of hours. But they never survived from their gameplay alone. They survived by being a community, an online consistent existence, a digital third space when physical third spaces are becoming rarer. And until people stop wanting that third space between work and home, they will keep existing.
Thank you for watching. Another massive thank you to all the supporters on Patreon and Twitch who keep the channel alive. You can support from only £1 a month. Check the video description for links to our Patreon, Twitch, Twitter, Instagram and Discord. And as always, have a great day.